Alright, so we have one of our athletes here, Miss Maria. She's a volleyball player going to play college volleyball at Slippery Rock. And we're just going to assess her vertical jump real quick, share with you what we see from a coach's perspective. So we basically break the vertical jump down into three phases. So one is descent, two is the pause at the bottom, and three is when she comes up, her concentric part. So we'll start with the loading. So number one, I'd like to see her a little bit taller. So if we assess her hips real quick, so she's obviously bent, she's already kind of preloaded. I prefer to see her nice and tall, basically more like this. So I'd like her start tall and her arms way, way above her head. So that's kind of number one. That's going to create a longer lever, so distance, for her to be able to load her legs, her hips, her glutes, her quads a little bit more for her vertical jump. So I can already tell right from the bat, even though she jumps all day for volleyball, she hasn't been taught the essentials or basics of how to get the most out of her jump. So that's kind of part number one. So definitely load, and again, if the better that we load, the better we have ability to come up and off the ground. It's kind of like stretching a rubber band. The greater and harder that I pull the rubber band, the greater distance it's going to be able to shoot and produce more force. So she's not getting the most out of her jump right now. So same thing, her load right now. So she's pretty good on her load. She's probably a little bit too deep, I would say. She kind of gets too deep into her squat, but that could just be, her strength is, maybe she has some stronger legs. But anyway, so she gets a little bit deep for her squat, but a lot of athletes make that mistake. Sometimes they'll go too deep. Everyone jumps a little bit different. And then, so obviously her takeoff. So number one, the biggest thing I see with her takeoff is actually a lot of things. But so number one is, again, her arms. She did not use her arms on the way up. You can tell, let's see. So she throws them up. The furthest that they get is basically in line right here with her head. All right, her arms again should be reaching up for the ceiling, and ideally her hands would be in line with her ear, basically right here. So they should be reaching straight up above her head to take her vertical. And that will take us into part number two. As you can see, when she takes off right here. So this is roughly where her takeoff point is. Actually, we'll go right over her ankle bone. So that's her takeoff point right there. And let's see where she lands. And she travels forward. So she goes forward a bit. So she needs to be able to produce more of her force vertically. So she starts there, travels forward a couple inches. So that's basically lost force. So when the athlete travels more, not more, but horizontally, meaning this direction, and not, instead of going straight up, trying to land in the same spot, some of that force is going to be lost because she's traveling forward. But again, that could be because of volleyball. When they have a tendency to jump up, try to block somebody, they typically drift forward a little bit. So that just comes up with teaching her how to jump and get her technique, get the most out of it. So one, use the arms. Two, go straight up. And three, she's not getting maximal hip extension right here, as you can tell. So if we drew this little angle, so her head, her hips, and her ankle down here. So she's at 154 degrees of hip extension. So again, we know that she should basically be 180. So as you can tell, she'd almost be reaching, not backwards, but straight up. Maybe the line's not perfect, whatever. But anyways, you can tell that she's a little tilted forward, which again could cause her jumping horizontally more so, her covering ground that way. So she's not getting full hip extension. So she's leaving some power that she has on the table. And then obviously we also look at the landing mechanics too, the repetitive stress. So this is another extra little bonus thingy, but you can see how much her knees are going forward. So she probably has a lot of stress. She has a lot of work on her quads and a lot of stress in her knees. Maybe she has some knee tendonitis or something, because you can tell her landing mechanics, all of her stress is going to be forward. So if we drew a straight line from her head to her heels, like that kind of, you can see most of her body, is over here on the front side. So that's where all the stress is going onto her knees. Kind of all coming down right in there. So something we want to teach her how to do is be able to use her hips better. So ideally we'd pull her hips back a little bit like that, and she would land almost in the same takeoff position that she had, which is right here. So see how her hips are back right here? If we drew that same line over her heels. So she's kind of split. Some of her body's in front, but she has a good loading of her hips back here. That's kind of what we want to see on her landing, as opposed to just landing haphazardly. And you can see these knees just shooting forward and taking all the stress off of her, all the stress of her landing. So that's just kind of how we'd assess her jump mechanics, her landing mechanics, because again, these volleyball girls are jumping hundreds of times in practice, so every time they land, that's repeated stress on their knees that could be saved to the longevity of their career and their entire health. But that's just kind of how we'd assess her jumping, her mechanics. So some things we would do to fix that: number one, give her a target over her head to reach for straight up. That'll kind of fix the reaching straight up and also getting her to apply her force vertically up. And then basically two is her landing. Teach her how to land with her hips back, so that way she loads those hips, her hamstrings, and really saves her knees for jumping and all the other stuff needed for volleyball.